April 13, 1986, 1:45 p.m. Frank DeCicco stepped out of the Veterans and Friends Social Club on 86th Street in Brooklyn, keys jingling in his hand. The spring air was warm, perfect weather for a Sunday drive back to Staten Island. This was Bensonhurst, the heart of Italian-American Brooklyn, where respect and tradition still meant something, where men like Frank DeCicco were treated like neighborhood royalty. DeCicco was John Gotti's underboss, the second most powerful man in the Gambino crime family. At 52 years old, he had survived 3 decades in organized crime through intelligence, loyalty, and calculated violence. He had just finished a 3-hour meeting about expanding their construction rackets into Queens. He walked toward the 1985 Buick Electra parked directly outside the club. The car was spotless, detailed weekly by a crew that understood the importance of maintaining respect through appearances. Chrome bumpers gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. DeCicco had bought the car 6 months earlier, paying cash from his share of the Castellano assassination profits. It was a symbol of his rise to power, a reward for betraying his former boss. He inserted the key into the driver's side door and pulled the handle. The explosion could be heard 15 blocks away. The blast launched DeCicco's body 60 feet across the street, through the front window of a grocery store. The car completely disintegrated, leaving nothing but twisted metal and shattered glass covering the entire intersection. Emergency responders would later say they had never seen anything like it. The bomb had been packed with enough C4 explosive to level a small building. Frank DeCicco, John Gotti's most trusted lieutenant and closest friend, was dead before he hit the ground. But what the rival families who planted that bomb didn't know was that they had just declared war on the most dangerous crime boss in New York history. To understand why someone wanted Frank DeCicco dead, you need to understand what happened 4 months earlier outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, December 16, 1985. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, was gunned down in one of the most brazen assassinations in Mafia history. The hit took place at 5:26 p.m., during rush hour, in front of hundreds of witnesses. John Gotti had orchestrated the hit, but he hadn't acted alone. Frank DeCicco was his partner in the conspiracy. The planning had taken 6 months. DeCicco was the inside man, the trusted underboss who could get close to Castellano without raising suspicion. He was the one who suggested the meeting location. He convinced Castellano to bring only 1 bodyguard instead of his usual 3-man security team. On that cold December evening, DeCicco provided real-time updates on Castellano's movements to the 4 shooters positioned outside Sparks Steakhouse. When Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up to the restaurant, DeCicco was already inside, sitting at a corner table with a direct view of the entrance. He watched through the window as his boss stepped out of the car. He watched as 4 men in identical trench coats opened fire with automatic weapons, pumping 17 bullets into Paul Castellano's body. DeCicco sat calmly at his table, finishing his espresso, as his boss died on the sidewalk outside. Without Frank DeCicco's betrayal of his own boss, the Castellano assassination would never have succeeded. The other New York crime families had watched in horror as Gotti eliminated Castellano without commission approval. In the Mafia's traditional power structure, bosses don't get killed without authorization from the other families. Gotti had broken the most sacred rule in organized crime. Vincent Gigante, boss of the Genovese family, and Anthony Tony Dux Corallo, boss of the Lucchese family, made a pact. They would eliminate the 2 men responsible for destroying the old order. John Gotti and Frank DeCicco had to die. The contract went to a specialist, Herbert Pate, a professional bomber who had been eliminating targets for organized crime since the 1960s. At 58 years old, Pete was considered the most skilled explosives expert on the East Coast. Pete wasn't Italian, which made him perfect for the job. Born in West Virginia, he had learned his trade as a demolition expert in the coal mines before discovering that his skills were highly valued by criminal organizations. If he got caught, he couldn't be traced back to the families. Pate had eliminated 17 targets over 2 decades, using bombs that ranged from simple pipe explosives to sophisticated remote-controlled devices. He charged $50,000 per contract, payable only upon successful completion. Pate spent 2 months studying DeCicco's patterns. He rented an apartment across the street from the Veterans and Friends Social Club, documenting every detail of DeCicco's routine. Every Tuesday and Sunday, DeCicco met with Gotti and other family members at the club. He always arrived at exactly 10:30 a.m., always parked in the same spot, always stayed for exactly 3 hours. DeCicco never varied his path, never checked for surveillance, never took precautions that might indicate he suspected danger. The plan was simple and devastating. On Sunday morning, April 13th, Pate arrived at the club at 6 a.m., 3 hours before DeCicco was scheduled to appear. The streets were empty except for a few early morning joggers and dog walkers. Pate had designed a remote-controlled bomb using military-grade plastic explosives stolen from a construction site in New Jersey. The device was small enough to fit under a car's gas tank but powerful enough to guarantee that whoever triggered it would not survive. He attached the bomb to the underside of DeCicco's Buick with industrial magnets. The remote detonator had a range of 200 yards, giving P plenty of distance to avoid the blast. Then he waited. At 10:30 a.m., DeCicco arrived for his weekly meeting with Gotti. He parked in his usual spot and walked into the club, completely unaware that his car had been turned into a weapon designed to kill him. But what nobody knew was that this wasn't just about eliminating DeCicco. It was about sending a message to John Gotti that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades. The meeting inside the club ran longer than usual. Gotti was paranoid about federal surveillance and insisted on discussing business in code, which slowed down every conversation. They talked about construction bids, union contracts, and territorial disputes with other families. DeCicco checked his watch. 1:30 p.m. His wife was expecting him home by 3 for Sunday dinner with her family. He needed to leave soon. "I'm heading out," DeCicco announced, standing up from the table. "Tell everyone I said goodbye." Gotti barely looked up from the financial reports spread across the table. "See you tomorrow, Frankie." Those were the last words John Gotti would ever speak to his best friend. DeCicco walked outside into the spring sunshine. Across the street, Herbert Pate sat in a stolen Ford van, watching through binoculars. His finger hovered over the detonation button. DeCicco approached his car, keys in hand. He was thinking about dinner, about his wife, about the new grandchild he was expecting in 2 months. He inserted the key into the door lock. Pate pressed the button. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. The Buick disappeared in a ball of orange flame and black smoke that rose 3 stories into the air. The fireball was so intense, it melted the chrome off cars parked 50 feet away. Windows shattered in buildings 3 blocks away. The shockwave knocked pedestrians to the ground and set off car alarms throughout the neighborhood. Children playing 3 blocks away stopped their games and stared in the direction of the sound. DeCicco's body was thrown across the street with such force that it left an impression in the brick wall of the grocery store. The impact was so violent that the medical examiner would later determine that every bone in his body was broken. The explosion crater in the asphalt was 3 feet deep and 8 feet wide. Pieces of the Buick were found embedded in buildings 2 blocks away. The engine block was discovered on the roof of a 3-story apartment building. Giuseppe Torino, the 67-year-old owner of the grocery store, had been arranging produce in his front window when DeCicco's body crashed through the glass. The elderly Italian immigrant was knocked unconscious. "I thought it was the end of the world," Torino later told investigators. "It was like a war zone." The medical examiner determined that DeCicco died instantly, never knowing what hit him. Inside the club, John Gotti was knocked to the floor by the blast. The force of the explosion blew out every window facing the street. Plaster fell from the ceiling, and the building's foundation cracked from the shock wave. For a moment there was complete silence. Then Gotti realized what had happened. He ran outside to find his underboss scattered across 86th Street in pieces too small to identify. The car was completely gone, leaving only a smoking crater in the asphalt. Gotti stood there for 30 seconds staring at the destruction, understanding exactly what this meant. The rival families weren't just eliminating DeCicco. They were sending him a message: "You're next." Within minutes, police cars and ambulances surrounded the scene. FBI agents who had been surveilling the club rushed to collect evidence. News helicopters circled overhead, but Gotti was already gone, escaping through the club's back entrance with his remaining bodyguards. The DeCicco assassination accomplished something the rival families hadn't expected. Instead of intimidating John Gotti, it transformed him into something far more dangerous. Over the next 6 months, Gotti launched a campaign of retaliation that would become legend in organized crime circles. The violence was systematic, calculated, and devastating. The first target was Anthony "Fat Tony" Ribito, a Lucchese family soldier found in the trunk of his Cadillac in Queens, shot 3 times in the head execution style. 2 weeks later, Vincent "Vinny Hands" Marone, a Genovese captain suspected of providing intelligence for the bombing, disappeared while walking his dog in Little Italy. His body was never found, but his severed hands were delivered to a Genovese social club in the Bronx. Michael "Mickey Boy" Paradiso, a Lucchese associate who had boasted about knowing details of the DeCicco hit, was found floating face down in the Gowanus Canal with his tongue cut out. The message was clear: talk about the bombing, and you lose the ability to talk forever. 3 Lucchese family soldiers disappeared without a trace. 2 Genovese captains were found shot execution style in Queens. The violence escalated beyond individual murders. Gotti's crew began targeting the economic interests of the rival families. Lucchese-controlled construction sites were bombed. Genovese gambling operations were robbed at gunpoint. The bomb that was supposed to send a message to Gotti had instead ignited a war that would consume the New York Mafia for years. But perhaps the most significant consequence was what the assassination revealed about loyalty in organized crime. Frank DeCicco had betrayed his boss Paul Castellano to help Gotti rise to power. 4 months later, DeCicco was dead, killed by enemies who saw him as a traitor to the traditional Mafia code. The lesson echoed through organized crime for decades. In the Mafia, betrayal is always a two-way street. The man who helps you eliminate your enemies today might be your enemy tomorrow. John Gotti learned this lesson too late to save his best friend, but he never forgot it. But what made the DeCicco assassination even more chilling was the precision of the operation. Herbert Pate had studied his target for months, learning every detail of his routine, every vulnerability in his security. The bomb itself was a masterpiece of destructive engineering. Pate had packed 12 pounds of C4 plastic explosive into a metal container no larger than a shoebox. The remote detonator used military-grade technology stolen from a National Guard armory in Pennsylvania. The explosion was so powerful, it registered on seismographs at Columbia University, 15 miles away. The blast created a crater 3 feet deep and 8 feet wide in the middle of 86th Street. Every window within a 2-block radius was shattered. Cars parked on both sides of the street were flipped over by the shock wave. A city bus passing by was knocked onto its side by the force of the explosion. The grocery store where DeCicco's body landed had to be demolished because the structural damage was too extensive to repair. The owner, an elderly Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Torino, never reopened his business. "I saw too much death in the old country," Torino told reporters. "I came to America to escape this violence. Now it follows me here." Federal investigators would later determine that the bomb used enough explosive to destroy a small apartment building. The overkill was intentional, a message that no amount of security, no level of protection could save someone marked for death by the commission. But the most terrifying aspect of the assassination was how close John Gotti came to being in that car. Originally, Gotti had planned to leave the club at the same time as DeCicco. They were supposed to drive together to a meeting with construction union leaders in Queens. But at the last minute, Gotti decided to stay behind to review financial reports from their gambling operations. "I had a bad feeling," Gotti would later tell his attorney. "Something told me not to get in that car, whether it was instinct, paranoia, or pure luck. That decision saved John Gotti's life. If he had left with DeCicco as planned, both men would have died in the explosion." The rival families had come within 5 minutes of eliminating the most powerful crime boss in New York. The investigation into DeCicco's murder would drag on for years without producing any arrests. Federal agents arrived at the scene within minutes, but the bomb had destroyed virtually all physical evidence. FBI Special Agent Bruce Mall, head of the Gambino family task force, had been tracking Gotti for years. "We knew who ordered the hit," Mall later wrote. "We knew who built the bomb, but knowing and proving in court are two completely different things." The explosion had been so powerful that forensic investigators couldn't recover enough evidence to build a prosecutable case. Herbert Pate had chosen his explosive cocktail carefully, leaving no distinctive chemical signature. The FBI interviewed over 200 witnesses. Most claimed to have heard nothing, seen nothing, and known nothing about Frank DeCicco or his criminal activities. "This is Bensonhurst," one elderly woman told investigators. "We mind our own business here." Herbert Pate disappeared immediately after the bombing, fleeing to a safe house in Miami before eventually relocating to Central America. The Genovese family had provided him with new identification documents and enough money to disappear permanently. FBI agents knew who was responsible, but proving it in court was impossible. The bomb had destroyed all physical evidence. There were no witnesses willing to testify. The commission's code of silence remained unbroken. Vincent Gigante and Anthony Corallo never publicly claimed responsibility for the assassination, but word spread quickly through the criminal underworld. The message was clear: challenge the traditional power structure, and you will pay with your life. For John Gotti, DeCicco's death marked the end of his old approach to leadership. The boss who had once been accessible to his soldiers, who had held court in public restaurants and social clubs, disappeared behind layers of security. Gotti began varying his routes, changing his schedule, using decoy cars and body doubles. He stopped meeting in regular locations, instead conducting business in moving vehicles or safe houses that were used only once. The paranoia that would eventually contribute to his downfall began with the explosion that killed Frank DeCicco, but perhaps the most lasting impact of the assassination was how it changed the relationship between New York's crime families. The old system of negotiation and compromise was replaced by a new reality. Disagreements would be settled through violence, and violence would be answered with greater violence. The car bomb that killed Frank DeCicco on that spring Sunday in Brooklyn marked the beginning of the end for the traditional American mafia. The commission system that had maintained order for 50 years was breaking down, replaced by chaos that would eventually destroy them all. The psychological impact of the assassination extended far beyond the immediate participants. Every crime family in New York began implementing new security measures. The era of accessible mafia leaders conducting business in public restaurants and social clubs was over. John Gotti's response to the assassination revealed both his strengths and his fatal weaknesses as a leader. His retaliation campaign demonstrated his capacity for violence, but his increasingly paranoid behavior would eventually provide federal investigators with the evidence they needed to destroy him. Vincent Gigante and Anthony Corallo had achieved their immediate goal of eliminating one of the Castellano assassination conspirators, but their victory was Pyrrhic. The violence they unleashed would eventually consume their own organization. By 1990, both Vincent Gigante and Anthony Corallo were serving life sentences in federal prison, victims of the very violence they had initiated with the DeCicco bombing. Herbert Pate lived in comfortable exile in Costa Rica for 15 years before dying of natural causes in 2001. He never returned to the United States and never faced prosecution for his role in the assassination. April 13, 1986. One remote detonator, one devastating explosion, and the message that would haunt John Gotti for the rest of his criminal career. In the Mafia, nobody is untouchable, and every betrayal will be answered. Frank DeCicco thought he was getting into his own car for a routine drive home. Instead, he was stepping into a trap that had been months in the making, designed by enemies who understood that sometimes the most effective way to destroy a king is to kill the man standing next to his throne. The explosion that ended Frank DeCicco's life began a war that would consume the New York Mafia for the next decade, proving that in organized crime, every act of violence creates the seeds of future violence. John Gotti had eliminated Paul Castellano to become boss of the Gambino family. 4 months later, his enemies eliminated Frank DeCicco to send Gotti a message: "Your turn is coming." If this story of loyalty, betrayal, and the bomb that changed everything moved you, hit that subscribe button. We're telling the John Gotti stories that reveal the true cost of power, the moments that defined the Teflon Don, the explosions that shattered criminal empires. Drop a like if you see how one car bomb sent a message, heard around the world. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Frank DeCicco walking toward that car? Would you have sensed the danger? More legendary Gotti stories coming next. Don't miss the rise and fall of America's most dangerous mobster.